This will be the first of 3 videos that demonstrate how to use link to entities to select data, or rather project data, from our sample database. This will be very practical and hands-on in nature. These are the kinds of queries that I find myself writing on a day-to-day basis. You certainly could write more complex queries than what I'll demonstrate in the next 3 videos, but I'm guessing that if you're like me, these are the ones that you'll be writing 80% of the time. So it's important that we get these under your belt as quickly as possible. Also, I want to emphasize as we begin that we're not querying the database, we're querying entity objects. And I think that's an important distinction to make, because when you state it in those terms, it forces you to explicitly think about the entity model, not the database structure. As we learned in the previous video, your entity model might look dramatically different than the underlying database tables and columns due to the mapping layer, again, that we discussed in the previous video. However, as we get started, it certainly is possible to see how link to entities translates your queries into Transact SQL and then sends them to the database through the agency of a set of APIs called the Object Services. Again, these APIs help you use the entity framework, and so we can use one feature of that object service in particular called toTraceString to see the query that's constructed by link to entities before it actually sends it off to SQL Server in this case. So as you can see, I still have the ADONet for link to entities project that we originally created in day 9. And what I want to do, start off with, is just work with this code. I'm going to add some code here, right here, to actually work with the toTraceString and grab out and see what the query is going to look like. So we're just going to call this a string called query, and we're going to work with object query, and I'm going to use the control period on my keyboard and add the system.data.objects namespace. Alright, so what I want to do with that is I'm going to use it next to the customers. So I have var customers here, and what I'm saying is I want to take customers and cast it to the type object query. I'll wrap all that up in another set of parentheses, and I'll hit the dot on my keyboard to get to the members of object query, and I want to select toTraceString. So now I should be able to do console.writeLine and then look at the query, and then we'll run the rest of the query just as we did previously. So let's run the example now, and you can see before we get the results, Jaworski orders 3 and so on, we can actually see the select statement. So there is a join going on here, although we don't see it using the inner join syntax. We see a variation on that. So we're selecting, and then you can see there's something called extent1, and then here's an extent2. That is a way that the link to entities API is naming or aliasing the tables. For example, customers as extent1, and here we see orders as extent2. So here we pull all of the columns from the customers table, and then we're pulling also the orders table, and then doing the join here where extent1.customerID equals extent2.customerID, and extent2.orderamount is greater than 150. And you can see that applies to this where clause that's already in our link to entities query. Okay, so I just wanted to point that out. I'm going to comment this out, but if at any point you want to see what is going on behind the scenes, just take this same approach to find out and see what is being constructed in the T-SQL that'll be sent to SQL Server. Alright, so let's move on. Actually, I'm going to comment most of this out, and I just want to start at the very beginning. You're already familiar with the link syntax, I know, but I want to just make sure that we start back at the beginning here with simple selects and then work our way forward, and you can see some of the things that are distinct to link to entities. Alright, so the first and the most easiest query that I can come up with is just a simple query. And I'm going to do this both using the query syntax and the method syntax. So let's start off with the query syntax. And so we're going to do var customers equals from C in, and then we want to use our DE, which, as you'll recall, is our new database one entities object. Okay, this is our context, our data context. All right, and then we'll do something like for each var C in customers, console.writeLine, and then C dot, and we'll just pick one, last name. All right, so in this case, we're pulling every one of the columns in our select statement, but we're only going to use one of them. So let's run the application, and you can see we're grabbing both last names from the two records we have in our sample database. All right, so that's using the query syntax. Let me comment that out and do the same thing now with our method syntax. And it's as easy as that. Now let's run it, and we get the same results. Okay, great. But as we said in the previous video, we really just want to only project out those columns that we're actually going to use. We don't want to pull every column from our database. That's wasteful on system resources. So in this case, we're going to create a simple query, but we're going to project out only the column that's needed. And so how to do this using query syntax? It's as simple as var customers equals from C in our context customers, select last name. Now this is only if we need one column. I'm going to go ahead and copy this. So let's go ahead, and if you see now, when I paste this in, we don't have a collection of objects. We're only pulling a collection of strings. And so there is no, you'll see the error here, the string does not contain a definition for last name. You're like, what in the world does that mean? Well, it's because it's considering C in this case. Each individual item in customers is an iQueryable of type string. And so C is iQueryable of type string, therefore we don't need this dot last name. Okay? So now let's run the application, and we get the results we were expecting. Okay? And the same can be true of the method syntax. Here, all we need to do is var customers equals de.customers.select. And so this is where the method syntax gets a little more wordy than the query syntax. We have to use the select and then pass in a lambda expression. Given C, only give me back the last name property. So let's run it, and then we should get the same results, and we do. Okay. And I think I've stated this before with regard to links. Sometimes the query syntax is more succinct, and sometimes the method syntax is more succinct. Either way, typically you want to try to use the query syntax. I think that's what's recommended by Microsoft, but I don't think it really matters one way or the other. Whatever you're more comfortable with is what you should use. All right, so now moving on, we want to also create a simple query, but this time we want to select multiple columns. And we're going to do that by creating a new anonymous type to hold the columns we need. Now previously we didn't have to do that. In fact, when we were looking at this example up here, since we were selecting every one of the customers or every one of the columns of the customers, we could, instead of doing var C in customers, we could have just put customer C in customers, because we know that it's pulling back the entire customer class, or all of the properties for customer. But using var gives us the opportunity to work with just those columns that are being pulled back. It's defined in a new anonymous type. We don't have to know the name of that anonymous type because, again, it's anonymous, right? Just wanted to kind of recap all those things we've talked about in the past. Here again, the query syntax. Var customers from equals from C in de.customers, select new, and then open close curly brace, C dot last name, and C dot first name. And then we can just, I'm going to copy that and then paste it down here. And then we want to plus space and go C dot, and you can see we only get first name and last name because that's all we're pulling back in our new anonymous type. So now let's run the application. Great. All right, so that's with the query syntax. Let's do it with the method syntax. And so here we want to do var customers equals de.customers.select C. Now I could probably start with like first name and then hit comma, and I don't get any IntelliSense. In fact, I don't even get, I'm not getting what I would expect to get here. So what I have to do is this rather. There we go. C dot last name and then C dot first name. Okay. So you can see the syntax is going to look very similar. It's just a matter of remembering to use the lambda expressions, which are basically this, inside of the select method using the method syntax. Okay, and we get the same results as we would expect. Great. All right, and then finally I want to use the where clause. So here again, I'm just going to copy this, and then I'm going to execute the application. Whoops. Okay, so we're only pulling one row back. Then if we're pulling one row back, then we should, if you think about it, when we want to do this, what we expect to see, since there's only one row available, when we expect to see that one row and get to its state property, but it doesn't exist. That's because what we're pulling back is always a collection. And in the one of the next videos, we're going to look at how to pull back only one item from a list instead of the entire list. If we're only expecting one item in the database, it might be beneficial to only bring back one row and then work with one row and not have to do any, looping through just to get to that one row of data or that one entity object that we retrieve from our entity model. Okay, we'll talk about this a little bit more in an upcoming video. Let me just show you the method syntax. And so here, var customers equals de.customers.where, and then here we'll go notice that I don't have to use the select in this case. All right. Okay, so I wanted to keep it simple in this first pass. All we did in this video was we took a look at object services and specifically the toTraceString method to return back the query that's actually being executed against SQL Server to retrieve and populate, hydrate objects within the entity model. We also looked at simple selects, how to work with a single column in a select statement, multiple columns returned back in an anonymous type, how to use where clauses and some other related items. So we're going to pick this back up in the next video. See you then. Thank you.